Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. This is Mike again, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our PowerShell Basics series of videos I'm putting together, and this one specifically looking at the get member commandlet. So in a previous video we talked about using get help and all the different details and intricacies that go along with that. And that can really give us an edge here on figuring out what commandlets are available to use within PowerShell. So how to find them, running them, looking at the parameters and all the details that go along with that. So that gets us using the correct commandlet. Now, getMember is going to take that further and examine the output of those commandlets. So as I mentioned previously, PowerShell is built on top of the .NET framework. So any commandlet output is in the form of a .NET object. And that .NET object has a whole bunch of information that goes along with it. So we're going to use getMember to examine that commandlet output. We're going to look at the membership details of it, and we'll talk a bit about manipulating that output. So let's change over to our VM here and have a look. So in here, we have just a typical Windows server here that I have PowerShell running on. And let's say we'll take a commandlet, maybe let's say like get service here. And I go ahead and I run it, and we get some output. Right now, what a lot of people associate this with is they kind of look at it almost like an output in like a Linux console or a DOS or command prompt in Windows, where it's just a bunch of text. Right? And then we manipulate it as if it is text. Now, with PowerShell, anything that produces output is in the form of an object, even though it doesn't really look like it here. So that's where commandlets like getMember can come into play. So I can take whatever the commandlet is that produced the output and pipe it to the commandlet getMember. And I go ahead and I hit enter on that. And what we see here when we're using it is we see that running this produced this type of object out of this namespace in the .NET framework. So it produces a service controller object. Okay, so this commandlet, when it runs, the output that it produces is a service controller object. Right? And then we can look at a bunch of information about it. Right? Now, again, why is this something we might want to consider? Well, you can't always tell what PowerShell is up to just by looking at the output that shows up on the screen by default. So for instance, if I come back here and let me make the screen up a little smaller here just to look at one service, I go ahead and I run it, and you would make it seem like PowerShell's producing output that has three pieces of information. So you have status, name, and display name. And potentially that's all there is to get. But in fact, if we look at the getMember output, we can see that this commandlet is producing this object and has this information that goes along with it. So we can see there's a lot of properties and there's a lot of methods and one event, which is part of the event handler class. That would be something used by a developer writing a program, if you will, right? Writing an app. But for us in PowerShell, as just PowerShell users, methods and properties are going to be the things we're going to want to pay attention to because those are the things that are the easiest to manipulate within PowerShell. Right? Um, so this commandlet produces that service controller. And you could do this with anything that produces output. So maybe we'll do get event log, log name system, and we'll do the newest, I don't know. And yeah, let's do newest one just to look at something simple here, right? So run something like that. Okay, well, what is that producing for an object? Right? So this is what we see on the screen, but that's not the whole story. So if I take whatever produced the output and pipe it to get member, we could see what it is producing for an object. Okay, so in this case, it's producing an event log entry object from the system.diagnostics namespace. And we can see that there's some methods on here and properties. And more properties than what the initial screen output was showing. So the initial screen output showed index time, entry type, source, instance ID, message. Okay, so what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if we go count them down here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, there's 16 properties here. Okay? Yes, I'm counting the script property as well. So there's 16 of them if I'm counting correctly. Okay? So that shows me there's more information to be had there than what I'm potentially seeing on the screen. Okay? So again, you could do this with anything that produces output. So for instance, if maybe I go query get 80 user, and let's see, who do I have for a user? Do I have an Aiden? Yes, I do. Okay, so pipe that to get member. And again, we could see what is being put into the pipeline here, right? What that object is producing for output. Right? So as I mentioned, anything can be useful when it comes to doing this. Right? So now the first thing to pay attention to, if you ever watch other PowerShell users or watch any other videos on YouTube or anything like that, very rarely do we ever type out the full word here, the full cmdlet get dash member. There's a very common alias that goes along with it, which is just GM. So if I take whatever this is, pipe it to GM, I can see my output here. Okay? So again, this cmdlet is producing this object. Okay? Now, what's happening here is when you run some cmdlet on a line here, it's what's considered a command line. And a command line can be one cmdlet, it could be multiple cmdlets. And in essence, what happens is the output that a cmdlet produces is put into a space in memory that we call the pipeline. And that pipeline holds .NET objects. Right? So anything, again, that's being produced here produces that .NET object. Now, why is it doing that? Because we might want to, kind of if you notice here, I can pipe the results of one cmdlet to another. So like, let's say if I wanted to do this, you see that the service is stopped in this case. And what I'd like to do is take the output of this and pipe it over to this. Okay, so I'm not going to say what service I want to start. That's being supplied by the output from the previous cmdlet. Okay, so this is considered to be one command line. So the first cmdlet runs, produces that service controller, if you will. So it's kind of like it's putting that service controller into PowerShell's pipeline, and then the data is then passed to the next cmdlet on the command line when you run it, when you hit enter. Right? So in this case here, I go ahead, I hit enter, and it goes ahead and runs. Now, what if there isn't another cmdlet there, like in the case up here? Well, what happens is the same beginning part happens here. As in, this cmdlet produces its output as one or more .NET objects, puts it into PowerShell's pipeline, and in this case, there's no other place for it to go. There's no other cmdlets to pass the data onto on the line here. So what PowerShell does is it outputs the data to the screen, okay, where you see it on the console here. Okay, so that's what makes output that you see on the screen. It's basically PowerShell rendering a .NET object for screen output. And PowerShell has a whole bunch of rules in it for how that's done. Okay, so it's actually called the view definitions, view V-I-E-W, view definitions. And if you dig into kind of the guts of PowerShell, there are view definition files in PowerShell's directories, if you will, where PowerShell information is installed. And there happens to be one for service controllers in this case. So there is a view defined for PowerShell that says if there's a service controller, it needs to be written to the screen. We are going to output it as a table and do status, name, and display name. Okay, so that information is there. Okay, so how do we know that though? Like how do you guys know that I'm just not making that up? Well, first things first, again, remember that get service here is producing this service controller object. Okay? Now, what I'm talking about is if let's say we, oops, let's not go there. Let's say if we go into where PowerShell happens to be installed here. So we go into the Windows directory. Let's go down to System32. All right, and we'll go down to Windows PowerShell. All right, V1, which has nothing to do with the version of PowerShell you're running here. And we can see a few different files here. They're not always going to be in the same spot. So some views are defined in the individual module folders. Like for instance, here's the view definitions for Active Directory objects. But for the one I'm talking about here, if I go into this .NET types file here, so maybe just open it with, like Notepad or something, and examine it. Let me make it a little bigger here. So I'm just not gonna, I'm just gonna do a Control F here, and we were looking for a service controller. Okay, so let's find that in this file. And notice right here, so it's about, I don't know, a quarter of the way down the file, you could see a new view being defined. That view is called service. This is the object that the view is for. And you can see here it's making a table. You can see this table control element here. It's creating headers where they're width of 8, 18, and 38. So there's 3 columns at those widths. And then the properties that go in there, the table column item, the first column is the status property, the second is name, and the third is display name. Okay, and that's exactly what we were seeing in our output right here. All right, so what was it, 8, 18, and 38? So there are status, name, and display name. So that's why that looks like this. All right, so now, to tackle the second one here, why did start service not produce any output? Well, not every commandlet puts objects into the pipeline. So some commandlets just do their job without necessarily producing output. Okay, so like I did the start service here. Now I've been talking for a little bit, so the service might have stopped again, but let me just rerun this. And then let's immediately go and get it. And you can see that it did in fact work. It just didn't produce any output doing it. So that's why you didn't see anything on the screen. Okay, so just FYI, if you run something and nothing shows up on the screen, it doesn't necessarily mean it didn't work. It just meant that that commandlet didn't produce any output into the pipeline. Okay, so once everything was run, once we got to here, everything was run, there was really nothing left in the pipeline, so nothing showed on the screen. So like a bit of empty right there. All right. So now let's go further into here and let's look at the get member again. All right. So again, we're looking at our, taking whatever this produces for output, piping it to get member, and that shows me the object. And then we can examine the details of that object, what we refer to as the membership. All right. So you see this column here, member type, where we can mainly see properties and methods. Okay, if we look at those 2 columns here. So we got methods up here, we got properties down here. Okay. Now these are almost letter by letter or fact by fact right from the .NET framework. So if anybody's a developer or if anybody looks at the .NET documentation, you'll find it's the same. So you could actually pop this namespace here with the name system.serviceprocess.servicecontroller right into a search engine, and you'll get linked to Microsoft's page for this particular .NET object. All right. Now the properties represent facts about the object. Okay, so this could be like if you look at maybe a user object out of Active Directory. You know, a user has a first name, a last name, a department, an email address, a home directory, a logon script. So the facts about the user. So those are your properties. Now, methods represent actions you can do against that object. Okay, so like again, let's take a user out of Active Directory. What would be methods? So methods could be you could enable a user, you could disable a user, you could rename a user, you could unlock a user. Right? So these are actions you can take. Now, how about some other type of object like a file? Well, a file, if you look at the properties of it, what could a file have? A file could have a size, a modified date, um, a owner, a permissions list. These are all things that would be facts about that file. So that would be like properties, right? And then what would be methods for a file? So these are actions you can take against it. So a file could have, for actions, you could delete the file, you could rename the file, you could compress the file, encrypt the file, create a file, if you will. So those represent the actions you can take against it. So every object out of the .NET framework is going to have properties, which are facts about it, and then methods, actions you can take against it. All right? Now, when working with PowerShell, though, the authors of the commandlets have the opportunity, since they're developing the commandlet and how it outputs information, they can add some extra stuff onto it. Okay, so they cannot obviously modify the .NET object. That's kind of set in stone by Microsoft for every Microsoft program that uses the .NET framework. But the author of a commandlet can add extra stuff on. Okay, so it's kind of like you're accessorizing it. And that's where like these things come in right here, these alias properties. These are basically add-ons by the person who wrote that commandlet that produced this object, get service. Okay, so an alias, there's an alias of name, which isn't really making a new property up, it's just referencing service name. So you could see service name is one of the properties down here. Okay. And then if we look at required services, that's really referencing services depended on, which again is one of the properties right down here. Okay? So you can have these extra things added on. Okay? Now you could also have extra methods added on as well. Okay, so again, these are not part of the .NET framework. These are added on by the commandlet that's producing the output in PowerShell. So this toString method is basically a way to take this output and make a string object out of it. Okay, so a lot of different commandlets have for their output, they've added this method on in case we wanted to make the output look like just a bunch of text, okay, which might come in handy. Okay? So those are things that are added on from the method side. Right? But because the membership always shows up alphabetical, the alias properties go up top, kind of they're separated from the actual properties, right? And then the script method goes at the bottom, again, separated from the actual methods. But if they were to be sorted a little differently, I mean, this is just an extra method that's added on that we could use. And these alias properties up here, just extra properties that were added on. Okay? When viewing this object through PowerShell, not part of the original .NET framework. Okay, so that's what the membership's going to look like. Now, other interesting things here to observe is we can see these different properties, but it's telling us more about it as well. So we could see for each property what data is actually in there. Right? So we could see like can pause continue is a Boolean object. That means it's set to either true or false. We could see display name is a string object. Service handle is a, man, that's a mouthful right there. System.runtime.interops.safehandle. Yeah, so that's it. So it's a safe handle object in the system runtime interop services namespace. All right. And then the last thing to see here, like say we look at service name, it's a string. And then we see this in brackets here, this get and set. So that tells me if the value is changeable or not. So if you see something like can stop, see how there's just a get there. That tells me that that particular property is read only. And if I see service name here, this is get and set, which tells me that potentially I could change that value if I wanted to. So I can look at it, I could read it, but I could also write it. Okay? Now, on some things, though, you can't tell the whole story because your PowerShell console might not be wide enough. Like it's truncating off with these 3 lines here. So I can't see the whole value potentially. All right. So how can we fix that? So there's a few different ways to kind of alter screen output, but the easiest one in this case is to take the output of getMember and pipe it to another commandlet called format table and use the wrap parameter. And then when you run that, so again, let me show what that was again, because the output is pretty fast. So with wrap, what it does is anything that can't fit in the column, it scrolls it down to the next line. So notice some of these properties, see how they take more than one line. All right, so there's one there. The wait for status method, that takes 4 lines of output. So you could see the whole thing. All right, so with the methods, what it's showing you is the method name and all of the arguments that go inside of it. All right, so that could be useful if we wanted to utilize the different methods. Now again, PowerShell's not making this up. This is pulling it straight out of the .NET framework. If you were to go look up the wait for status method for in this case, a service controller. All right. So that's a way to manipulate the output. Just use format table to see all of the information that's in this definition column if it's being truncated off. So when you see something like here, it's being truncated, so the wrap will make each of these columns show the full details of them. So that makes it easier sometimes to examine. All right. Now, not to turn it into a format table thing here, but you could also, with format table, just like getMember had an alias of GM, format table has an alias of just FT if you wanted to do that. All right. So that could be a way to fully examine the output of pretty much any commandlet. Any commandlet that produces output, getMember can show that information here. All right. So again here, using getMember, it's next to help. It's probably the most popular commandlet I think I use. So getMember is a very common one when you're trying to figure out what a commandlet is producing for output and what's in your pipeline, knowing if you can pass that to another commandlet or not. Okay, so in an upcoming video, I will get into that, those details. That's known as pipeline parameter binding, where you can actually examine how the output of one commandlet is being sent to be the input for another. So the membership details, so that's again looking at the properties and the methods that are there for the object, and manipulating the output, being able to use format table to see the extra details for what's going on here. All right. So again, have a look, keep an eye out for that upcoming video for looking at pipeline parameter binding. And that will kind of step on or step into next where we leave off here with get member. So thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.